He folded the newspaper along its center crease, pressing it flat with both hands as if it might curl back on its own. The edges didn't quite line up, so he adjusted them again. Then he left it there on the table, untouched. The coffee in front of him had gone still, not cold yet, but past the point where steam rose from it. He sat with his hands wrapped loosely around the cup, though he wasn't drinking. His fingers rested more than held, as if the warmth was something he didn't want to lose too quickly. The bell above the diner door rang. He looked up, not quickly, not sharply, just enough to catch who it was. A couple stepped in, brushing snow from their coats. The woman laughed at something the man said, and they paused near the entrance, deciding where to sit. The old man watched them for a second longer than needed. Then he looked back down at the table. He lifted the cup, took a small sip, and placed it back in the same spot. A faint circle had formed beneath it. The waitress noticed him the first time because he didn't move much. Most customers came in with a purpose. Breakfast before work, a quick lunch, something warm before heading back out into the cold. They talked. They checked their phones. They asked for things. He didn't. He came in just after 9 every morning, always choosing the same booth by the window. He sat facing the door, not the street, though the window beside him offered a clear view of both. He ordered coffee, nothing else. "Just coffee," she had asked the first time, pen already hovering over her pad. He nodded once. "Black." Another nod, that was it. No small talk, no hesitation, no sign that he might change his mind later. She had brought the coffee, placed it in front of him, and moved on. At first, she didn't think much of it. There were regulars like that. People who came in more for the space than the food. People who needed somewhere to sit where no one would ask too many questions. But by the third day, she began to notice the pattern. He stayed a long time, longer than most. He would sit there through the late morning rush, through the quiet stretch that followed, sometimes even into early afternoon. The cup would empty slowly, then be refilled once, maybe twice. He never asked for the refill, she just brought it. He always thanked her with a small nod, no words. It wasn't unfriendly, just contained. On the 5th day, she noticed something else. The way he looked at the door, it wasn't constant, not obvious. But every few minutes his eyes would lift just slightly in that direction, not searching exactly, more like checking, as if something might have changed in the few seconds he wasn't looking. She started to time it without meaning to, 3 minutes, sometimes less. The bell would ring and he would glance up, just like he had that first morning she noticed him. His expression didn't change when new people came in. It didn't fall or bright. It stayed the same, but he looked. Always, the diner had its own rhythm. Mornings were loud, plates clattering, chairs scraping, voices overlapping. Orders called out from the kitchen. Coffee poured in quick, practiced motions. By 10:30, it softened. By 11, it was almost quiet. That was when his presence became more noticeable. He didn't fill the space, but he didn't disappear into it either. He just stayed. The same posture, the same table, the same careful way of folding his newspaper, even though he rarely read more than a few lines at a time. Sometimes he turned a page, sometimes he didn't. The waitress found herself slowing down when she passed his table, not stopping, just noticing. The way his coat was always buttoned, even while he sat inside. The way he kept his hat on the table beside him, not hanging it on the rack near the door. The way his hands moved. Slow, deliberate, like each action had been thought through before it happened. On the 8th day, she refilled his cup and hesitated for a moment. "You want anything else?" she asked. Her voice was softer than usual. He looked up at her, not startled, but as if he hadn't expected the question. He shook his head. "No, thank you." His voice was quiet, not weak, just unused. She nodded. "All right." She stepped away, but something about it stayed with her, not the words, the pause before them. Like he had to reach for them. The next morning it snowed, not heavily, but enough to cover the sidewalks in a thin, even layer. The kind that made everything look cleaner than it was. She arrived early, stamping her boots at the entrance before heading inside. The heat hit her face, warm and familiar. He was already there, sitting in the same booth. The newspaper folded, the coffee in front of him. She glanced at the clock, 9 o'clock exactly. She wasn't sure when he came in. She hadn't seen him arrive. "Morning," she said as she approached. He looked up and gave a small nod. "Morning." She poured fresh coffee into his cup, though it was already half full. "Roads are bad out there," she said, more to fill the space than anything else. He glanced toward the window, then back at her. "Yes," he said, that was all. She waited a second, then moved on, but as she walked away, she felt something shift, not in him, in herself. It was a small thing, a recognition maybe. Or the beginning of one. Over the next few days, she paid closer attention, not in a way that would make him uncomfortable, just enough to notice the details she had missed before. The way he straightened the sugar packets, even though he never used them. The way he wiped the edge of the table with his napkin, slow and careful. The way his eyes lingered on the door just a fraction longer when it stayed closed. She started bringing his refill before his cup was empty. He never asked for it. He never refused it, just that same small nod. One morning she placed the cup down and said, "You come in early." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes." You like it quiet? A pause, then, I suppose, she smiled just a little. It doesn't stay that way long. He almost smiled back, almost. The bell rang again. Both of them glanced toward the door. A man in a heavy coat stepped in, shaking off the cold. He looked around, chose a table near the back, and sat down. The old man's gaze followed him for a second, then returned to the cup in front of him. The waitress noticed. That was when it became clear it wasn't just habit, it wasn't just something to pass the time. He was waiting. She didn't know for what or for who. But it was there in the way his attention shifted every time the door opened. In the way he stayed long after his coffee should have been finished. In the way he never seemed surprised but never stopped looking. That afternoon, as the diner emptied out and the light outside softened, she found herself standing near his table longer than necessary. He had finished his second cup. The newspaper was folded again, tighter this time. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, thank you," she nodded, but she didn't move right away. "You waiting for someone?" she asked. The words came out gently, not prying, just there. He looked at her, not defensive, not closed off, just quiet. For a moment it seemed like he might not answer. Then he glanced toward the door. "Yes," he said. The answer settled between them, simple, unadorned. She felt the weight of it without understanding it. "Okay," she said softly, and that was all. She walked away, but something stayed behind, at his table, at the door, in the space between the two. The next morning she noticed him before she even tied her apron. He was already seated just as he had been every day. Same booth, same posture. The newspaper folded with care, resting near the edge of the table like it had been placed there with intention rather than habit. The coffee had just been poured. She could tell by the thin curl of steam still rising. He hadn't touched it yet. She stood near the counter for a moment longer than necessary, watching him without meaning to. There wasn't much to see. He wasn't doing anything unusual. But now that she had asked the question the day before, now that she had heard his answer, everything about him seemed slightly different. Not changed, just clearer. She walked over with the coffee pot. "Morning," she said. He looked up. "Morning." She poured a little more into his cup, though it was already full. "Still waiting?" she asked, the words coming out before she had fully decided to say them. He didn't seem surprised. "Yes." No explanation, no elaboration, just that. She nodded as if that was enough. Maybe it was. Through the morning she moved between tables, taking orders, clearing plates, refilling cups. The usual rhythm settled in around her, familiar and steady. But her attention kept drifting back to him, not constantly, just in small moments. When the bell rang, when the door opened, when someone stepped in from the cold and paused to look around. Each time she found herself glancing at him, and each time he was already looking. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't anxious, but it was consistent, like breathing. Around 10, a group of 3 came in, loud and cheerful. They took the booth across from his, their voices filling the space with an energy that didn't quite belong there yet. He looked up when they entered, watched them for a second, then lowered his gaze again. One of them laughed loudly, the sound sharp against the quieter tone of the diner. He didn't react, not outwardly. But she noticed the way his fingers shifted slightly on the cup, tightening just a little before relaxing again. She brought him a refill. "Careful," she said out of habit. "It's hot." He nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated. "You always sit here," she said, keeping her voice light. "You ever try the other side?" He glanced toward the windows behind him, then back at her. "No." "Why not?" A small pause, then, "I like this one." She followed his gaze. From his seat the door was always in view. She nodded. "Fair enough." She moved on. By 11 the rush had faded. The group across from him paid their bill and left, their voices trailing behind them as the door closed. The diner settled into that quieter space again, where every sound seemed a little more distinct. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft clink of dishes being stacked, the low murmur of a conversation in the corner. He remained, still at the table, still facing the door. She wiped down a nearby booth, her movements slower now, less hurried. "Can I ask you something?" she said, not looking at him directly. He didn't answer right away, but he didn't refuse either. After a moment he said, "You can ask." She smiled slightly. "That doesn't mean you'll answer," a faint shift in his expression. "No," she nodded. "That's fair." She set the cloth down and leaned lightly against the back of the booth across from him, giving him space. "How long have you been waiting?" she asked. This time the pause was longer. He looked at the door, then at the table, then back at her. "A while." It wasn't dismissive, just incomplete. She didn't push. "Days?" she asked. "Yes." "Weeks?" Another pause, then "Yes." She let that sit. "And you think they'll come?" He didn't look at her when she asked that. His eyes stayed on the door. "Yes." The certainty in his voice was quiet, but it was there. Not strong in the way people try to convince themselves, just steady. Like something that had already been decided. She felt something in her chest shift, not discomfort, not quite sadness, something closer to recognition. She nodded again. "All right." She picked up the cloth and went back to work. The rest of the day passed the same way it always did. Orders, refills, small conversations with regulars, but the question stayed with her, not just what he had said, but how he had said it. That evening, as she counted out the register and slipped on her coat, she found herself thinking about him again. About the way he had said yes, not hopeful, not doubtful, just yes. The next morning, she arrived a little earlier than usual. The sky was still pale, the light not fully settled. The sidewalks had been cleared, but patches of ice remained, catching the light in dull, uneven ways. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth met her again, so did he. Same booth, same position. She checked the clock, a few minutes before 9. "You're early," she said, setting her bag down. He looked up. "So are you," she smiled. "Fair point." She moved behind the counter, poured a fresh pot of coffee, and brought it over to him. He hadn't ordered yet. He never did. She placed the cup in front of him. "On the house," she said. He looked at her. "That's not necessary." "I know." A small pause. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and stepped back. For a while, neither of them spoke. The diner was quiet, just the two of them and the low hum of the building waking up. She busied herself with small tasks, restocking napkins, checking the sugar containers, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. But she stayed aware of him, the way he sat, the way he waited. Around 9, the bell rang. He looked up. A woman stepped in, her coat pulled tight around her. She paused, scanning the room before choosing a table near the window. He watched her for a moment, then looked down again. She noticed the way his shoulders shifted, just slightly, almost nothing, but it was there. She walked over. "You okay?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. He nodded. "Yes." "You sure?" Another nod. "Yes." She didn't press. "All right." She poured more coffee into his cup. "You let me know if you need anything." "I will." He never did. The hours passed. Customers came and went. The bell rang again and again, each time the same movement, his eyes lifting, checking, returning. Around noon, a man in his 30s came in, phone pressed to his ear. He spoke loudly as he walked, not noticing much around him. He sat at a table near the center, still talking, still distracted. The old man looked up when he entered, watched him, then looked away. The waitress noticed something then, not just the routine, not just the waiting, but the pattern within it. He wasn't just looking for anyone. He was looking for someone specific, not in a way she could describe exactly. But it was there, in the way his gaze lingered for a fraction longer when certain people walked in, in the way it moved past others without pause, as if he was measuring something quietly without needing to think about it. That afternoon, when the diner had emptied again and the light had shifted towards something softer, she walked over and sat down across from him. She didn't ask first. She just sat. He looked at her, surprised, not uncomfortable, just noticing. "You mind?" she asked. He shook his head. "No." She folded her hands on the table. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said. "I just sit sometimes, too." He nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, not awkward, not heavy, just quiet. "You said you've been waiting a while," she said eventually. "Yes." "Do they know you're here?" The question hung there. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved to the door again, then back to the table. "I don't know," he said. She felt that one land differently. "Did you tell them to meet you here?" A small pause. "Yes." "And they haven't come yet?" "No." She took a slow breath. "Maybe they got the time wrong," she said. "Maybe. Or the day. Maybe." His answers didn't change. They didn't move toward hope or away from it. They stayed in that same quiet place. She studied his face for a moment. There were lines there, deep but not harsh, the kind that come from years, not from strain. "You still think they will?" she asked. He looked at her. "Yes." The same answer. The same tone. She nodded. "Okay." She didn't know what else to say, so she didn't say anything. They sat there for a few minutes more, the silence settling comfortably between them. Then she stood. "I've got to get back to work." He nodded. "Of course." She walked away, but something had shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone else, but she felt it, in the way she moved, in the way she listened for the bell, in the way she glanced at the door even when she wasn't near him. The waiting had extended. It wasn't just his anymore. The next few mornings settled into something that felt familiar, though it hadn't been there before. Not routine exactly, more like a shared awareness. She didn't need to look at the clock anymore to know when he would arrive. By the time she stepped inside, brushing the cold from her sleeves, he was already there, sitting the same way, facing the same direction. But now, when she noticed him, it wasn't just noticing, it was acknowledging. A quiet recognition that passed between them without needing to be spoken. "Morning," she said one day, placing his cup down before he could ask. "Morning," he replied. She poured the coffee slowly, watching the way the dark surface settled in the cup. "You sleep all right?" she asked, almost without thinking. He considered the question. "Yes," he said, not quickly, not automatically, but as if he had checked the answer before giving it. "That's good," she said. She didn't ask anything else. He didn't offer anything more. It was enough. The bell rang. Both of them looked up. A man entered, stamping his boots, pulling off his gloves. He glanced around briefly before heading to a table near the window. The old man's gaze followed him, then returned. The waitress stayed for a moment longer than usual, then she moved on. By now, she had started to recognize the difference between his glances. There were the quick ones when someone clearly wasn't who he was waiting for. And then there were the slower ones, The ones where his eyes stayed just a second longer, as if something in him paused before letting go. She couldn't tell what made the difference. It wasn't age. It wasn't how they were dressed. It wasn't even how they moved. It was something quieter than that, something she couldn't quite name. Late that morning, a woman came in alone. She looked to be in her 40s, maybe early 50s. She wore a long coat, her hair pulled back, her expression neutral in the way people carry when they're focused on something else. She stepped inside and paused, just for a second. Her eyes moved across the room. The waitress noticed. So did he. His gaze held, longer than usual, not by much, but enough. The woman chose a table near the middle of the diner, not too close to the door, not too far from it either. She sat down and removed her gloves slowly, placing them neatly beside her. The waitress approached her with a menu. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yes, please," the woman said. Her voice was calm, measured. The waitress nodded and went to get it. As she poured the coffee, she glanced back toward the booth. He was still looking, not staring, but watching. When she brought the cup to the woman's table, she noticed something else. The woman's eyes had shifted too, not directly toward him, but in his direction, like she had felt something without fully turning to see it. The waitress set the cup down. "Let me know if you need anything," she said. The woman nodded. "Thank you." The waitress stepped away, but she didn't go far. She stayed within view, not intentionally, just present. The old man's hand moved toward his cup, then stopped. He didn't pick it up. The woman stirred her coffee, though she hadn't added anything to it. The spoon moved slowly against the ceramic. A soft, repetitive sound. The bell above the door rang again. Both of them looked up. A couple entered, their voices low, their movements easy. The moment shifted, just slightly. The old man looked back down at the table. The woman took a sip of her coffee. The connection, if it had been one, passed, or maybe it hadn't been anything at all. The waitress felt something settle, not disappointment, not relief, just something unfinished. She returned to her work, clearing plates, wiping tables, moving through the space the way she always did. But her attention stayed divided between the woman and the man. The woman finished her coffee in about 20 minutes. She paid at the counter, offering a small smile as she handed over the bill. "Have a good day," the waitress said. "You too," the woman replied. Then she left. The bell rang. The door closed. The old man had looked up when she stood, watched her walk to the counter, watched her leave. His expression hadn't changed, but his eyes had followed her until the door shut. Then he looked back down. He picked up his cup, took a small sip, set it down. The waitress approached slowly. "Was that her?" she asked, her voice quiet enough that it wouldn't carry. He didn't look up right away. He kept his gaze on the table for a moment, then he shook his head. "No." The answer was simple, but this time something in it felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just more defined. She nodded. "Okay." She poured more coffee into his cup. He didn't stop her. "Did you think it might be?" she asked, a pause. "Yes." "Why?" He considered the question. "Then I'm not sure." She let that sit. Sometimes that was the only honest answer there was. They didn't speak for a while after that. The diner moved around them, steady and unchanged. People came in, people left. The bell rang again and again. Each time his eyes lifted, each time they returned. That afternoon, as the light outside shifted towards something softer, she found herself sitting across from him again. She didn't ask, she just sat. "You ever miss a day?" she asked. He looked at her. "Yes." "Recently?" A small shake of his head. "No." "You think they might have come on one of those days?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved to the door, then back to her. "It's possible. You ever check?" "How would I?" She paused. "I don't know," she admitted. "Ask someone maybe." He nodded slightly. "Maybe." They sat in silence for a moment. "You remember exactly what they look like?" she asked. This time the pause was longer. He leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze drifting somewhere past her, not quite focused on anything in the diner. "Yes," he said. "Clear as day?" "Yes." She studied his face. "Then you'll know when they walk in." "Yes." There was no doubt in his voice, none at all. She felt something settle again, that same quiet certainty. It didn't feel fragile. It didn't feel like something that would break if pressed. It just existed. "Do you ever think about going somewhere else?" she asked. "Waiting somewhere different?" He shook his head. "No." "Why here?" He looked around the diner, at the tables, at the counter, at the window, then at the door. "We agreed on this place." The waitress nodded. That was enough. She didn't ask when. She didn't ask how long ago. She didn't ask anything else. The answer held its own weight. That evening, as she wiped down the last table and turned off the lights above the booths, she glanced at his seat, empty now, but still there. Still holding the shape of something that had been there all day. The next morning, she arrived with something in her pocket. She hadn't planned it. It had just felt like something to bring. She walked in. He was there. Of course he was. "Morning," she said. "Morning." She poured his coffee. Then she reached into her pocket and placed something on the table, a small folded card. "What's this?" he asked. "Nothing much," she said. "Just in case." He looked at it, then at her. "In case of what?" She shrugged slightly. "In case you're not here one day." He didn't touch the card right away. "What is it?" "My name," she said, "and the diner's number." He looked at her for a moment, then at the card again. "Why? So if they come when you're not here, someone can tell you." The words settled between them. He picked up the card slowly, held it for a moment, then placed it carefully beside his cup. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "It's nothing." But it was. They both knew that. The bell rang. He looked up. So did she. Someone entered, not who he was waiting for, but they looked anyway, both of them. The card stayed where he had placed it, just to the right of his cup. Flat against the table, its edges lined up with the grain of the wood as if it belonged there. He didn't unfold it again, but he didn't move it either. The next morning when she came in, it was still there. He had arrived before her like always, same booth, same position, the newspaper folded, the cup waiting, the card beside it. "Morning," she said, setting her bag down behind the counter. "Morning." She poured his coffee without asking. The motion had become automatic now, something her hands did before her mind caught up. "You left it here," she said, nodding toward the card. "Yes. You don't want to take it with you?" He looked at it, then back at her. "I know where it is." She gave a small smile. "Fair enough." The bell rang. They both looked up. A man stepped in, pulling his coat tighter as the cold followed him briefly inside before the door closed. The old man's gaze stayed for a second, then moved away. She wiped the counter slowly. "You ever think they might come later in the day?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. Why not?" A small pause. "Because we said morning." She nodded. That made sense, at least to him, and maybe that was enough. The hours moved the way they always did. The early rush came and went. The space filled, then emptied. The sounds rose, then softened. And through it all he stayed, waiting, looking, checking. Around 10:30 a man came in carrying a box, not large, but awkward enough that he had to shift it slightly as he stepped through the door. He set it down near the counter, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "Delivery," he said. She nodded. "Back there," she replied, pointing toward the kitchen. He carried the box past the booths. As he passed the old man, he glanced at him briefly, just a passing look, nothing more. The old man didn't react. His eyes were on the door. The delivery man disappeared into the back. The bell rang again. A woman entered, her scarf pulled up around her face. She lowered it as the door closed behind her, looking around the diner with a quick, practiced glance. The old man looked up, watched. The woman hesitated near the entrance, then chose a table by the window, not his side. The other one. He looked for a second longer, then backed down. The waitress noticed the way his hand moved. Not much, just a slight shift, as if he had been about to reach for something, then changed his mind. She brought him a refill. "Still hot," she said. He nodded. "Thank you." She didn't leave right away. "You remember what you were wearing that day?" she asked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked at her, then at his coat, then back at her. "Yes." "What about them?" He paused, then "Yes." "You think they'll recognize you?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes." There was something in the way he said it this time, not stronger, not louder, but more settled. As if the question had placed something into clearer focus. She nodded. "Okay." She stepped away. The bell rang again and again and again. Each time the same movement, the same glance, the same quiet return. By noon, the diner had emptied out again. The light outside had shifted, softer now, less sharp against the glass. She wiped down a table near his booth, her movements slow. "You ever get tired?" she asked. He looked at her. "Tired of what?" "Waiting." A small pause, then no. She leaned lightly against the back of the booth across from him. "Not even a little." He thought about it, then no. "Why not?" He looked at the door, then at her. "Because it's not something I'm doing." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He rested his hands on the table. "I said I would be here." She let that sit. "And that's it." "Yes." There was nothing else in his voice, no explanation, no defense. "Just that." She nodded slowly. "All right." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The bell rang. He looked up. So did she. A young man entered, his headphones still around his neck, his jacket unzipped despite the cold. He walked to the counter, ordered quickly, and sat down. The old man's gaze moved past him almost immediately. Not him. The waitress watched, not the young man, but the old man, the way he knew, without hesitation, without effort. That it wasn't who he was waiting for, it wasn't guessing, it wasn't hoping, it was something else, something settled. That afternoon, she found herself sitting across from him again. It had become easier now, less like an interruption, more like something that belonged. "You ever think about what you'll say?" she asked. He looked at her. When they come?" A pause, then no. "You do." He shook his head. "No." "Why not?" He looked at the table, then at the door, then back at her. "I'll know when I see them." She studied his face. There was no uncertainty there, no hesitation, just that same quiet steadiness. She nodded. "Okay." She didn't ask anything else. There didn't seem to be anything else to ask. The hours passed. The bell rang. The door opened, closed, opened again, each time the same movement, the same quiet check, the same return. Late in the afternoon, the light began to fade, not suddenly, just a gradual dimming that settled into the corners of the room. She turned on the lights above the booths, one by one. When she reached his, she paused. "You heading out soon?" she asked. He looked at the window, then at the door, then back at her. "Yes." "Same time tomorrow?" "Yes," she nodded. "I'll be here." He gave a small nod in return. "I know." He finished his coffee, slowly, carefully, as if there was no reason to rush and no benefit in lingering longer than needed. He picked up the card, looked at it for a moment, then folded it once along the crease she had made. He slipped it into his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." He stood, adjusted his coat, placed his hat on his head. Then he looked at the door just for a second, as if checking it one last time. Then he walked toward it. The bell rang as he opened it. Cold air slipped inside. Then he was gone. The door closed. The bell settled. The diner grew quiet again. She stood there for a moment, looking at the door, at the space he had just moved through. Then she turned back to her work. The next morning she arrived before 9, earlier than usual. The sky was still pale, the light just beginning to settle. She pushed the door open, stepped inside. The warmth met her. The quiet, the stillness. She looked toward the booth. It was empty. For a moment she thought she might have been early. She checked the clock. A few minutes past 9, she waited, poured coffee, set out the cups, wiped the counter. The bell didn't ring. She glanced at the door, then back at the booth. Still empty. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The diner began to fill slowly, the usual rhythm returning. Customers came in, sat down, ordered. The space changed, but the booth stayed empty. She felt something settle in her chest, not sharp, not sudden, just there. Around 10, she walked over to the booth, wiped the table, though it didn't need it, smoothed the surface with her hand, as if that might make a difference. The bell rang. She looked up. Someone entered, not him. She nodded to herself. Went back to the counter. Time moved, the way it always did, but something was different now, not in the diner, not in the sounds, but in the space between them. Around 11, she heard the bell again. She looked up. A man stood in the doorway, older, not as old as him, but close. He stepped inside slowly, looking around the room, not scanning, not searching, just looking. He paused near the entrance. His eyes moved across the tables, the counter, the windows, then they stopped on the booth. The one by the window, the one that faced the door, he walked toward it, slowly, carefully, as if each step needed to be placed just right. The waitress watched, didn't move, didn't speak. He reached the table, stood there for a moment, then sat down in the same seat, facing the door. He didn't order right away, he just sat, his hands resting on the table, his eyes on the door. The waitress approached slowly. "Can I get you something?" she asked. He looked up at her. "Coffee," he said. "Black," he nodded. "Yes," she poured the coffee, set it down in front of him. "Thank you," he said. She hesitated. Then, "Are you meeting someone?" He looked at her, then at the door, then back at her. "Yes," she nodded. "Okay." She stepped away. The bell rang. He looked up. So did she. The door opened, and for a moment it felt like something might align, but it didn't. Not yet. He looked. He waited, the same way, the same quiet certainty. And she stood behind the counter, watching the door too, not because she had to. Just because she did. The bell settled. The door closed. The room held its breath for a second longer than usual. Then everything continued, as it always had, as if nothing had changed, and yet something had.